This presentation is towards a biblical view of technology and the cultural impact of technology. Originally, I was going to break this into two presentations and try to divide it between biblical and cultural, and I really struggled in how to do that in a way without bifurcating the two. And really, I think one of the things I want to do in this class and even with this topic is to see that the Bible speaks to all of our life. I love this discussion on technology and on spirituality and how technology impacts us as individuals and culturally. Often, I don't think this is a topic that is often discussed. And yet, I think it's important that we realize that everything is spiritual, or maybe it'd be better to say that everything has a spiritual component. Even technology has a spiritual component. So, one could say this is a conversation about a theology of technology. Now, that's a big word, so maybe we could call it a philosophy of technology. I know theology and philosophy aren't the same thing, they're two different words. Essentially, we're saying, what are your beliefs about technology? And how should those of us that are thinking God's thoughts after Him, those of us that are trying to apply the Bible to all of our life, how might we think about this topic? How could we think critically about technology? Realizing, again, that everything has spiritual implications. Everything is either moving you closer to God or further away from God. So there's a comment there under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says that there's nothing new under the sun. And I like that term. And I often think of that and that Bible verse. And when I think of it, I think of bell bottom pants. But I also think of technology and how a lot of technology becomes recycled over and over and over again. And so we need to understand and see those patterns in history. I want in this presentation to look to the Bible for a new perspective on technology. Think about applying a biblical worldview to technology. I hope that you see that technology shapes us as individuals and as a society to a much greater extent than most have realized. And then also see that the Bible is not silent on the topic of technology. So here's a question for you. My views on technology most closely match the statement. And if I was doing this in person, I'd actually, have you raise hands and maybe we'd talk a little bit about this. But technology is mostly good most of the time, mostly bad most of the time. It depends. Or is it something else? So, at least in your head, try to answer this question. And oh, by the way, I will come back and ask this at the end of the presentation or the second presentation. My technology use has had a negative impact on our relationship. Now, if you're not married, I guess you can think of this with respect to your friends or your family. So think about this, yourself. My using of technology has it negatively impact my relationship with other people. And if you're married, maybe think about it with your spouse. Okay, the flip side of this is my spouse's use of technology has had a negative impact on our relationship. And so this is asking your spouse, and actually I probably should ask a third question. If your spouse answered this question, what would he or she say about your use of technology? Be interesting to compare that. Maybe that's a good dinner topic to have. So, what is the problem? Well, I think we need a different view. I think we need a biblical view, and I think we need to be woken up to the impact of technology on us as individuals and on a society as a whole. I love this quote from Roy in Not Theology slash Science as the defining dichotomy, essentially, where he says technology is, without any doubt, the world's most powerful and fastest growing religion. I don't know if I'd consider technology a religion, but that's just an intriguing statement that makes you go, yeah, and maybe even some of the discussions about how many of us are letting technology be a way for us to engage in our religious activity um, brings more credence to this statement. So, interesting thought. So, I think, again, part of the problem is we aren't thinking critically. We're not applying the Bible. We're not looking seriously about the world around us and looking at the impact of change. Most of you are probably familiar with Gollum and his my precious. My precious. But I wonder if any of you have thought about replacing the ring, and I'll come back to this later, with my precious, my iPhone or my Droid phone or some other technology. To what extent are we living a surface life? I love this image where it shows a surfer and then that surfer surfing the web and the whole imagery. I love to water ski, so I love to to fly across the top of the water. But how many of us are living a life where we're skimming the surface? We're not really going deep in our relationships. We're not going deep in our thinking. We're just skimming. I asked you to read the article from Nicholas Carr, well, a couple from him, but the one being the Atlantic article is Google Making Us Stupid. And I'll come back to this, but it's interesting, definitely, to think maybe not about Google making us stupid, but looking at the impact of technology and how it's shaping our brains. So, technology in the Bible. We'll cover this for a little while here. But before I jump in, have you ever considered, have you thought biblically about technology? Have the two thoughts never crossed your mind? Have they crossed your mind a little bit, rarely, considered it from time to time, or is it something you have considered? And then to what extent do you think the Bible speaks about technology? Would you say there are no Bible verses? I'm going to make all this up. Are there just a couple Bible verses, maybe 5, or are there 50, or are there 500, are there 2,500, are there more than 5,000 verses? Well, maybe you'd like to know what the definition of technology was. Well, I asked you to answer it without it or with your own definition. Here's Webster's dictionary, or Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So, technology, a practical application of knowledge. It's a manner of accomplishing a task. And I think this definition is somewhat helpful. Technologia, a systematic treatment of an art. So there's an art and there's a skill component to it. But I really appreciated the definition that came out of, well, I read it in Hips. Here's the book, The Hidden Power of Electronic Culture. And he got the concept from Marshall McLuhan, a writer from the 60s, and he wrote a number of books, but this definition came out of understanding media. And so the definition he utilized was that technology is an extension of man, or an extension of humanity. It extends or amplifies some part of ourselves. So anything that extends or amplifies some part of ourselves, Hips and McLuhan would consider to be technology. And I think part of the struggle for maybe some of the first questions I just asked is, well, especially with the information technology focus that is on this class, that a lot of people think, well, technology is only IT. But we're thinking much more broad than that, at least at this point. So with that new definition, To what extent does the Bible speak about technology? Did your numbers change at all? Did they stay the same? Now I'll go into a biblical review, looking at what the Bible says about technology. And I can't cover every verse here, but let me go over at least a few. Maybe a few too many, but at least a few. Before getting into specific verses, what about the flow of the meta narrative? What about the flow of the Bible? Well, we begin with the creation, and you could even say the creation speaks to God's creative forces and the creative potential that He creates in us. But I'm thinking more starting in a garden and moving to a city. And especially as you see in the end of Revelation, the big giant city that comes out of the sky. So it seems like that narrative, that direction of going from a garden to a city, involves at least progress, so that God is in some sense pro progress. There are Bible verses even before Noah, that Genesis 4 has a number of verses talking about technology in the city and some musical instruments and whatnot. But I think Genesis 5, 6, 7, the whole flood narrative, where God commands Noah to create an ark, a boat. And that's a form of technology that extends humanity's ability to move across water. And in this case, it extended humanity's ability to survive. So God commanded Noah, build this thing, and through that technology, God saved humanity. That's interesting. But it didn't take very long for technology to go the other direction. So Genesis 11, we see humanity creating a tower, the Tower of Babel. And out of this, we get many languages, we get humanity being scattered across the world. And what's an interesting portion of this narrative in Genesis 11, I wonder, do I have it? I don't have the exact quote here, but Genesis 11, the people basically said, hey, we want to stay connected. We want to stay, we don't want to get scattered. We want to be connected. So let's build a tower. And often people think of the tower as people working their way towards God. And that was a piece of it, but they don't see this other piece where they were trying to stay connected by building this technology. And then because of building that technology, the very thing that they wanted not to happen did happen, where they became disconnected. They became scattered across the world. It has interesting consequences for international business, but I think it says a lot, and maybe, just throw out the term Facebook here. A technology that's supposed to keep us connected, and yet to what extent is it doing just the opposite? It creates a surface connection that doesn't require or mandate that you can't have deep connections, but it sure seems to lead that direction. So Genesis 5 and then Genesis 11. So there's some interesting verses that I just love in Deuteronomy 17, Psalms 20, Psalms 44, where God commands the people of Israel, do not go back to Egypt and amass for yourself many horses and chariots. What were chariots? What is the equivalent of a chariot today? No, it's not a car. It would be a tank. So God was telling Israel, don't go back and get a lot of tanks. I don't want you to trust in technology. I want you to trust in me. What does that say? To what extent do we trust in our technology versus trusting in God? Story of David and Goliath. Only a boy named David. Sorry, I think of that song every time I think of that story. Here we have a story that is all about technology. David rejecting the technology that Saul gave to him. He was going to give him his armor and his sword, but David rejected that. But did he reject technology? No, he rejected the technology that was typical for the soldier of that day. And he replaced it with the sling and 5 smooth stones. Interesting, Goliath, he was formed with the technology of that day, and David was able to defeat him. And I think this is another story that tells us about trust and trusting in what technology should we trust in. Do we depend on our own strength, the bronze and the armor, or do we trust in God? There's a whole host of verses on idols. Exodus 20 with the Ten Commandments, Psalms 115, verses throughout the Bible that say, do not form any graven images. And again, if we were to go back to that, my precious, you might say, well, my cell phone isn't an idol. But I wonder if someone from 2,000, 3,000 years ago were to come back today and see us using our cell phones, see us at dinner with our head bowed and us looking down at our little device while we're eating dinner, if they wouldn't say, can I see that? That is an interesting idol that you're bowing down to. Or how many of us have seen someone else with their cell phone and had envy, wishing, oh, I wish I could get that precious that person has. So let's see, I think I got a couple more verses here. A whole host of verses in the New Testament where Jesus is basically saying, who are you going to serve? God or mammon? God or money? And you may think, well, money, that's not technology, but does it extend our ability to trade? Could we consider money to be a technology? Well, I think so. Verses in Romans 6 where we're told to be slaves to righteousness. So don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your own heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. And this seems to be talking more about becoming slaves to an individual, but to what extent have we as a society become slaves to technologies? There's 1 Thessalonians 5. Hold on to what is good, reject every kind of evil. So a general verse. Could that be applied to technology? Are there some technologies that are evil? Ephesians 5 talks about redeeming the time, and in some sense you can say that technology helps us be more productive, but many of you have already commented about how technology can also lead to a waste of time. Jesus, and even before Jesus in the Old Testament, talked about loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And this is a great verse to be asking yourself. To what extent is this technology helping me to love God better? To what extent is it helping me to love my neighbor better, my spouse better, myself better? Interesting verses. I'm just kind of thinking about a couple other verses. I could go over verse after verse after verse, but there was an interesting verse that talked about tools when the building of the tabernacle was done. That there were supposed to be no tools and no hammering and no sound while essentially what is now building of a church was being completed. And just interesting to think about, so God didn't want technology to be on site. during the construction. Interesting. One of my favorite verses, and I apply this to sports when I coach teams, and I think it applies to technology as well. There's a couple different places, one in Colossians 3 and then also in 1 Corinthians 10, where it says basically the same thing. And here in 1 Corinthians 10 it says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, your use of technology, that's one of the whatevers, isn't it? Do it all for the glory of God. So our use of technology, our use of computers, our use of our cell phones, our use of the internet should glorify God. The Bible itself could be considered a technology. It is a written word. It's tablets, the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, and we could talk more. Often we think of, well, a computer is a form of technology, but even your Bible, the written word, that was radical when we went from being an oral culture to having the word written down. And in a little bit I'll talk about how that change from people communicating mostly orally to using written communication really may have shaped society in greater ways than we had ever considered. Okay, this is the end of part one. I'll ask if you have any questions, comments, or pushbacks, but probably should listen to all of part two, and then I'll ask this same set of questions.